My name is Lena Prince, a first lieutenant in the United States Army, and at 37, I became a widow. Just 24 hours after an American flag was folded with crisp ceremony and placed into my hands at the funeral of my husband, Captain Marcus Coleman, I returned to our home in Richmond, Virginia, to find it being looted. His stepmother, Eleanor, stood in the center of our living room, her pristine white gloves pointing at my grandmother's armchair as if it were a pile of trash. "That one, out to the truck," she commanded her son, who then offered me a cold smirk. "Oh, Lena, so sorry for your loss," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with insincere sympathy. "But this is a Coleman house, for Coleman blood. You are not Coleman blood. It's as simple as that. Pack your things and go." Her other son, Timothy, picked up our wedding photo from the mantel, physically tore my image from the frame, and tossed it into a trash bin. "We'll keep the one of Marcus," he said casually. "He doesn't need you in the background anymore." They treated me like a sentry whose watch had ended, but they made a fatal miscalculation. They thought they were fighting a lone widow. They had no idea they were walking onto a battlefield my husband had already prepared. If you've ever been made to feel by your partner's family that you weren't good enough for them, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe. This fight is for all of us. The words hung in the air, heavier than the damp Richmond humidity that clung to the windows. Pack your things and go. I stood frozen in the foyer, the chill in the room having nothing to do with the weather. It was a coldness that seeped from the marble floors up into my bones, a hostile presence in a space that was once my sanctuary. The fireplace was lit, flames dancing silently behind a polished brass screen, but it offered no warmth. It was just light, illuminating the methodical dismantling of my life. Cardboard boxes were everywhere, stacked like barricades. Sharp, black letters spelled out the names of their new owners, Gerald, Timothy. They weren't just taking valuables, they were carving up my world, piece by piece. Eleanor moved through the room with the practiced air of an auctioneer, a stack of yellow sticky notes in one gloved hand. She paused at the mahogany sideboard Marcus and I had found in a small antique shop in Fredericksburg. A yellow square was pressed firmly onto its surface. "This for Gerald's dining room," her elegant script declared. She moved to the bookshelf, running a finger over the leather-bound classics Marcus loved. "Timothy's study," another note read. They were shopping in my home, with my memories as their inventory. My voice, when I found it, was quiet, devoid of the storm raging inside me. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" She turned, her expression one of feigned surprise, as if she hadn't noticed me standing there. "Lena, dear, we're simply preserving the family legacy." Her explanation was delivered as if it were the most natural thing in the world, a sacred duty. "Here in Virginia," she said, her tone becoming patronizing, "we value heritage. Assets must be passed down to those who carry the Coleman name to continue the line. It's how things are done." She spoke of bloodline as if it were a religion, and I was a heathen at the gates. She made her larceny sound like a noble obligation. I watched, my military training kicking in, forcing a disciplined calm over the screaming chaos in my mind. Observe, assess, do not engage without a strategy. I was no longer a grieving wife. I was an officer surveying a hostile takeover. Timothy, emboldened by my silence, sauntered over to the wet bar. He poured himself a generous amount of Marcus's best bourbon. Then, he picked up the one coffee mug I kept there, a simple white ceramic mug with Mrs. Coleman written in delicate blue script. It was a silly, happy gift from Marcus from our first anniversary. Timothy took a long drag from his cigarette and, holding my gaze, deliberately tapped the ash into my mug. A gray-black smudge sullied the white ceramic. It was a small act, but it was an act of profound desecration. It was a message. Even your name, your role, is worthless here. It is a vessel for our trash. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten, my hands curling into fists at my sides. But I held my ground. I didn't move. Eleanor saw the exchange. A flicker of satisfaction crossed her face before being replaced by that mask of counterfeit sympathy. She glided towards the hallway that led to our bedroom. Now, about your personal effects, she announced, her voice echoing slightly. She gestured toward my closet. I'll have the staff pack up your clothes. We can donate them. I'm sure someone will have a use for them. They were stripping me bare. Not just of my home, but of my past, my present. 8 years of marriage, of building a life with the man I loved, being erased and designated for charity. They were turning me into a ghost in my own home, and soon, I wouldn't even have that. Gerald placed a firm hand on my arm. It wasn't violent, but it was insistent. A silent order to move. I think it's time you left, Lena, he said, his voice low. They escorted me to the front door, the three of them forming a human wall between me and my life. As I stepped over the threshold, back into the world that no longer contained my husband, I heard the sharp, definitive sound behind me. Click. The sound of a new lock sliding into place. I stood on the porch, the door now a solid barrier of oak and steel. A light drizzle began to fall, the gray Richmond sky weeping the tears I refused to shed. My reflection in the dark wood of the door was a faint, distorted silhouette of a woman in black. A widow, an exile. My first instinct, the human instinct, was to pound on the door, to scream, to demand entry to my own home. But that instinct was quickly suppressed by years of discipline. A soldier doesn't waste energy on a fortified position they cannot take. They retreat, regroup, and plan their counter-assault. I turned away from the door without a word. I walked down the stone path, each step steady, measured. They could lock the door. They could steal the furniture. They could even try to erase my name. But as I walked away into the rain, one thought crystallized in my mind with absolute clarity. This wasn't a family squabble. This was a declaration of war. This was a military campaign. And it was time to draw up my plan of attack. The rain blurring my windshield was a fitting curtain for the act that had just closed. Each rhythmic sweep of the wipers seemed to scrub away the present, pulling me back into the past. This war hadn't started today, with a locked door and a stolen life. It began 8 years ago, not with a bang, but with a quiet, condescending nickname. The Little Soldier. That's what Eleanor and her sons called me. They never said it to my face, of course. It was always whispered just loud enough for me to hear as I walked out of a room. A verbal pat on the head for the girl from Ohio, playing dress-up in their sophisticated Virginia world. I was Marcus's novelty, the daughter of a union auto worker who had somehow ended up married to a Coleman. To them, my career as a logistics officer in the U.S. Army wasn't a source of pride. It was a quaint, middle-class hobby. At Sunday dinners in their sprawling Richmond estate, Gerald, the investment banker, and Timothy, the corporate lawyer, would hold court, speaking of multi-million-dollar deals and hostile takeovers. Their careers, entirely bankrolled by the family fortune, were deemed noble. Mine was reduced to a caricature. Lena is so vital to the national defense, Timothy once announced at the dinner table, a smirk playing on his lips. She's the logistics queen. Make sure our boys overseas are never without their creature comforts. They envisioned me in a warehouse counting crates, a glorified clerk, because in their world, power came from a stock portfolio, not from rank or responsibility. The fact that my work involved complex supply chains, managing millions of dollars in assets, and ensuring the operational readiness of hundreds of soldiers was an inconvenient detail they chose to ignore. Their contempt wasn't always so subtle. It had a way of escalating in public, as if they needed an audience to validate their superiority. I remember one charity fundraiser at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. The air was thick with the scent of old money and expensive perfume. I was in my Army service uniform, the deep blue jacket and white shirt crisp and immaculate. I felt a surge of pride wearing it, a symbol of everything I had worked for on my own merit. Eleanor was gliding through the crowd, a queen in her element, holding a glass of deep, red Cabernet. As she passed me, her arm gave a sudden, theatrical lurch. The red wine arced through the air, landing in a perfect bloody splash right across the chest of my white shirt. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. "Oh, my dearest Lena, how clumsy of me," she exclaimed, dabbing uselessly at the stain with a silk napkin. But her eyes, cold and calculating, held no apology. They held a glint of triumph. "I am so terribly sorry," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "That must be an absolute nightmare to clean. It's not like it's fine silk, is it?" The message was clear, delivered with surgical precision. She hadn't just stained my uniform, she had, in front of her peers, declared it, and by extension, me, to be cheap, common, unworthy of being in her world. I stood there, the cold, wet fabric clinging to my skin, my face burning with a humiliation that had nothing to do with the stain and everything to do with the public nature of the assault. Their attacks were always aimed at the things that defined me, outside of them. Marcus, bless his heart, tried to build a bridge. For our 3rd anniversary, he gave me a beautiful military-grade field watch. It was rugged, functional, with a compass and a durable nylon strap, perfect for my work. It was a thoughtful, meaningful gift that honored my identity. I loved it more than any diamond. Timothy saw it on my wrist during Christmas Eve dinner. He'd just been gifted a new Rolex from his mother, which he made sure to angle into the light at every opportunity. He picked up my arm, his fingers barely touching the watch as if it might soil him. "Well, this is practical," he sneered, the word dripping with disdain. "Mother just gave me this, a real timepiece. Perhaps when you retire from your little job, Lena, you can get yourself something more suitable for a lady." In their world, value was measured in carats and brand names. My watch, a symbol of Marcus's love and respect for my career, was dismissed as a crude tool. And by their metric, I was always found wanting. The lowest blow came from Gerald. It was at a cocktail party for his firm. One of his senior partners, a genuinely curious man, asked me what I did in the army. I opened my mouth to explain, to talk about my role and my responsibilities. Before I could utter a single word, Gerald stepped in, slinging a casual arm around my shoulder. "Oh, Lena does very important work," he said with a wide, charming smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She makes sure our soldiers have enough toilet paper and canned beans. Very heroic, wouldn't you say?" The partner gave a tight, uncomfortable laugh, and the conversation moved on. But I was left standing there, hollowed out. In one sentence, Gerald had reduced my entire career, my service, my honor, to a punchline. He had painted me as a glorified quartermaster for a platoon of grunts. It was the ultimate act of disrespect, meant to completely invalidate my life's work. I saw Marcus across the room. He had heard it all. His face, usually so kind and gentle, was a thundercloud. He set his drink down, walked over to Gerald, and gripped his younger brother's arm. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw the color drain from Gerald's face. I saw real fear in his eyes as Marcus's voice, low and menacing, cut through the party chatter. Later that night, as we drove home in silence, the weight of the evening settled between us. I didn't have to say anything. Marcus knew. If you've ever had your own hard-earned achievements dismissed by someone who never worked a day in their life, hit that like button and stand with me. And in the comments, just type the word honor. Let them know it's something money can't buy. He pulled the car over, turned to me, and took my hand. His eyes were filled with a fierce, protective love. "They're jealous of you, Lena," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "They're jealous because you built your own life, while they are just shadows living off a legacy they didn't create. Don't you ever let them make you doubt your worth." He paused, his grip tightening on my hand. "They don't understand honor, but I do. And I'll make sure they can never, ever touch yours." Marcus's last words to me on the subject echoed in the hollow space where my heart used to be. "I'll make sure they can never, ever touch yours. Honor." It was a word the Colemans didn't understand, a currency they didn't value. And in that moment, adrift in the rainy Richmond night, it was the only thing I had left to navigate by. My first thought wasn't of my own family back in Ohio. Calling them would only transmit my pain, turning their love into helpless worry. They wouldn't understand the nuances of this fight, the deep-seated poison of old Virginia money and pedigree. I needed a soldier. I needed someone who understood that some battles are fought not in the dirt, but in the soul. There was only one person to call. I drove through the gates of Fort Lee, the familiar sight of uniformed guards and military discipline, a strange comfort in the chaos. I pulled up to a modest, neat-as-a-pin house on the base, the kind reserved for senior officers. The porch light was on, a beacon in the gloom. I didn't even have to knock. The door opened, and there stood Major Sarah Jenkins, my former commanding officer and one of the toughest women I'd ever known. Sarah had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. She had eyes that could see right through you and a demeanor that could stop a charging bull. She took in my disheveled appearance, the funeral clothes I was still wearing, the profound exhaustion etched onto my face. She didn't offer condolences or ask what was wrong. She didn't need to. A soldier knows when another soldier is under fire. Without a word, she stepped aside, pulling me into the warmth of her home. Her movements were efficient, purposeful. She pointed toward the guest bathroom. Clean clothes are on the counter, size 8, should fit. Then she walked to her liquor cabinet, pulled out a bottle of good Kentucky bourbon, and poured 2 fingers' worth into a heavy glass. She set it on the coffee table. "Drink up, Prince," she said, her voice a low rumble. "Then you can give me your report." The next morning, there was no gentle awakening. At 0500 hours, Sarah was shaking my shoulder. "On your feet, Prince. We're going for a run." It was an order, not a suggestion. In the pre-dawn chill, we ran the perimeter of the base, our boots pounding a steady rhythm on the pavement. We ran in silence, our breath pluming in the cold air. The sky slowly bled from black to gray to a soft, hopeful pink. We didn't talk about the Colemans. We didn't talk about Marcus. We just ran, pushing past the pain in our lungs and the burn in our legs. It was a familiar ritual, a way to sweat out the poison, to replace emotional agony with physical exhaustion. It was the soldier's way. After the run, she drove us to the base's firing range. She handed me a pistol, a box of ammunition, and a pair of ear protectors. "You need to get loud," was all she said. The first shot was jarring, a violent explosion that ripped through the morning quiet. Then another, and another. The smell of cordite filled the air, acrid and sharp. I focused on the paper target downrange, on the front sight, on my breathing, on the steady squeeze of the trigger. All the rage, the humiliation, the profound, gut-wrenching grief. I poured it all into each shot. The tight cluster of holes in the center of the target was the only proof of the storm raging inside me. It wasn't gentle therapy with tissues and quiet murmurs. It was loud, violent, and precise. It was a release. Back at Sarah's house, a fragile calm had settled over me. I was physically spent, but my mind was clearer than it had been in days. While she made coffee, I finally went through the duffel bag I'd had with me since the funeral, the one containing the last few items Marcus had kept with him. Tucked into a side pocket was his Bible. It was small, pocket-sized, with a worn leather cover. Marcus wasn't a deeply religious man, not in the way the Colemans pretended to be. But he carried this with him on every deployment. He said it was his anchor. I ran my thumb over the soft, frayed leather and let it fall open. It opened to a page that was clearly read often, the corner folded down. A single passage was underlined with a steady, deliberate hand. It was from the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, verse 25. "She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come." The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. But these weren't the tears of a victim. They weren't born of grief or despair. They were tears of understanding, of revelation. This wasn't a random passage. This was a message. A final piece of intelligence from my husband. He had known this day would come. He had known they would try to strip me of everything, to leave me with nothing. And he had left me this reminder of the 2 things they could never take, the 2 things that were now my weapons. I read the verse again and again, the words sinking in, becoming a part of me. Strength, dignity. The uniform I wore, the life I had built, the very essence of who I was. A new resolve hardened within me, forging my grief into steel. The emotional storm had passed. The target was clear. The objective was set. I pulled out my phone and found the number Marcus had given me months ago. for a man he called his contingency plan. I dialed. The phone rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. Piton. My voice, when I spoke, was unrecognizable from the trembling, broken woman of the day before. It was steady. It was firm. It was the voice of First Lieutenant Lena Prince, United States Army. Mr. Peaton, I said, my tone as crisp as a salute. This is Lena Prince. I am ready to receive my briefing. The address Marcus had given me led to a stately old brick building in downtown Richmond, the kind with polished brass fixtures and quiet carpeted hallways that swallowed the sound of your footsteps. The plaque on the door simply read, Charles Peaton, Attorney at Law. But when I stepped inside, I knew this was no ordinary law office. The room felt less like a place for legal disputes and more like a general's command center. There were no shelves overflowing with dusty law books. Instead, the walls were lined with framed maps of historic battlefields: Gettysburg, Normandy, Antietam. The furniture was dark, solid wood, and the massive desk was clear of everything except a single, neatly squared-off folder. The man who rose to greet me matched the room perfectly. Charles Peaton was in his late 60s, with a full head of silver hair and the ramrod straight posture of a man who had spent his life in uniform. He was a former JAG officer, a lawyer for the Army, and his eyes held a calm, analytical sharpness. His handshake was firm, a grip of mutual respect. Lieutenant Prince, he said, his voice steady and professional. I've been expecting you. Please, have a seat. There was no small talk, no expressions of sympathy. He understood the mission. As I sat, he opened the folder on his desk, and I felt the entire dynamic of my situation shift. I was no longer a grieving widow, lost and alone. I was an officer, present for a briefing. Captain Coleman provided me with a comprehensive overview of all potential contingencies, Peaton began, his words precise. He was an excellent strategist. As such, we have a battle plan already in place. He slid a document across the polished surface of the desk. This is our first line of defense. I looked down at the paper. It was a copy of the deed to our house. My eyes scanned the legal jargon until I saw the key phrase he had highlighted, tenancy by the entirety. Peaton saw the question on my face. It's a form of joint ownership available to married couples here in Virginia, he explained, his tone that of a professor clarifying a crucial point. What it means, in simple terms, is that the moment Captain Coleman passed, 100% ownership of the property automatically, by law, transferred to you. A will is not even necessary. The house, the veterinary clinic, every major asset you own together, it's all yours, Lieutenant. It has been since the moment of his death. I stared at him, the words taking a moment to penetrate the fog of my grief. Automatically. By law. What they did, Peaton continued, his voice hardening slightly, was not a family matter. Legally speaking, it was breaking and entering, trespassing, and theft of private property. They have absolutely no claim. None. A wave of something hot and powerful washed through me. It wasn't just relief, it was a profound sense of vindication. Marcus had known. He had anticipated their greed, their arrogance, and he had built a wall around me, a fortification made of law and foresight. The weight of their condescension, their years of making me feel like an outsider, seemed to lessen under the sheer, brilliant weight of this legal fact. Then Peaton reached into the folder and pulled out something else. A sealed envelope, with my name written on it in Marcus's familiar, strong handwriting. He asked me to give this to you personally when the time came, Peaton said softly. My fingers trembled as I took it. I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was short, but every word was saturated with his love. My dearest Lena, it began. If you are reading this, then the fight I always feared for you has begun. I know you, my love. I know you are strong enough and smart enough to handle anything. You are the most capable officer I have ever known. But I couldn't bear the thought of you fighting this war alone, not while you were grieving. I can't be there anymore to shield you from their words, to stand between you and their contempt. So I did the next best thing. I built you a legal fortress, Please don't think for a second this is because I didn't believe in you. It's because I believe so fiercely in us, and what we built together deserves to be defended with everything I had. I love you. Always." A single tear escaped and fell onto the page, smudging the ink. I looked up at Peyton, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He simply nodded, giving me a moment. "Your husband was a remarkable man, Lieutenant," he said. "The last time we spoke, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, 'Mr. Peyton, my wife is an exceptional officer. All she needs are the orders and the right intelligence, and she will win this battle herself. Your job is to provide her with those.'" The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. To be seen, to be understood so completely by the man I loved. It was the ultimate validation, a shield against every insult the Colemans had ever thrown at me. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my jacket pocket, feeling its warmth against my chest. I sat up straighter. The grief was still there, a cavern in my soul. But now it had a purpose. I had my orders. Peyton seemed to sense the change in me. He became all business again. "Captain Coleman's plan has 2 phases," he stated, laying out his strategy. Phase 1, strategic patience. We let the Colemans operate under the assumption that they hold all the power. We let them dig their own hole, documenting their every illegal action. Their arrogance will be their undoing. He paused. Phase 2 is the counterattack. And that, Lieutenant, is where you come in. He reached into a desk drawer and retrieved a small single key. It was a simple, standard-issue brass key for a safe deposit box. He placed it firmly in my hand. "Marcus rented a safe deposit box at a bank downtown, in your name." He referred to the contents as his intelligence file. "It contains years of documentation he collected. Your mission now is to retrieve that file, study its contents, and familiarize yourself with the terrain. We will launch our counteroffensive only when we have total information superiority." I closed my fingers around the cold metal of the key. It felt heavier than a simple piece of brass. It felt like a weapon. It felt like the beginning. Peyton stood up, signaling our meeting was over. "This is the next step," he said, his eyes meeting mine with a shared understanding. Captain Coleman called it Operation Reconnaissance. The next morning, I walked into the imposing marble lobby of the downtown Richmond Bank, feeling a strange mix of dread and anticipation. This was it. Operation Reconnaissance. The key felt cold and sharp in my palm as I was led by a silent, suited employee into the vault. The air down there was cool and still, smelling of old paper and metal. He used his key, then mine, and pulled out a long, narrow metal box. Sliding it onto a private viewing table, he left, closing the heavy door behind him with a soft, definitive click. I was alone with my husband's secrets. My hands were unsteady as I lifted the lid. Inside, there was no stack of dusty legal papers. There was only a single, handsome leather briefcase. It was the one I'd given Marcus for our 5th anniversary. Seeing it felt like a punch to the gut, a sudden, sharp memory of a happier time. I took a deep breath, lifted it out, and set it on the table. When I clicked the latches open, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a collection of documents. This was an intelligence dossier. Marcus, my meticulous, methodical Marcus, had organized his entire emotional life with the precision of a military campaign. There was a series of small black moleskin notebooks, a single silver USB flash drive, and a stack of thick manila folders, each one labeled in his neat, block handwriting. The wine incident, career comments, estate plans, early discussions. It was a map of my own private war, a war I hadn't even fully understood I was fighting until now. With a knot tightening in my stomach, I opened the first notebook. The pages were filled with dated entries. Marcus had recorded every slight, every backhanded compliment, every condescending remark, not with anger, but with the dispassionate clarity of an officer documenting a pattern of hostile activity. He noted the dates, the times, the locations, and the exact phrasing. Reading it was like seeing the last 8 years of my life through his eyes, and realizing he had seen and felt every single cut they'd inflicted on me. I flipped to a folder labeled Prenuptial agreement. Inside were his notes from a meeting he'd had with Eleanor shortly after we got engaged. She had tried to pressure him into signing an agreement that would have left me with virtually nothing, framing it as a standard procedure to protect the Coleman legacy. Marcus had documented her exact words. "She's a lovely girl, Marcus, but she comes from nothing. You must be practical." He had refused, and the notes detailed the ensuing argument, a battle he had fought for me before our marriage had even begun. Then I saw it. A single folded sheet of paper in a folder simply marked appraisal. It was the printout of an email. My eyes scanned the header. The sender was Eleanor Coleman. The recipient was a high-end real estate agent in Richmond. I read the first line, and the blood in my veins turned to ice. Following up on our conversation, she had written, "I would like to proceed with a quiet, unofficial reappraisal of both the primary residence and the veterinary clinic property for a near-future transfer of ownership." My gaze shot to the date at the top of the page. It was sent 6 months before Marcus was even diagnosed. 6 months before the first shadow of illness had fallen over our lives, Eleanor was already planning to liquidate my future. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act of greed from a grieving family. This was a premeditated, cold-blooded conspiracy. For all my attempts at finding common ground, for all the holidays I endured and the smiles I faked, I had never been family. I had been a temporary obstacle. A cold, hard fury began to build in my chest, a glacial anger that was far more dangerous than the hot flash of humiliation I'd felt before. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about the calculated destruction of my life with the man I loved, planned by his own family while he was still healthy and strong beside me. I picked up the silver flash drive. My fingers were perfectly steady now. I plugged it into my phone. There were a half-dozen audio files, labeled only by date. I clicked on one from about a year ago, right after a particularly nasty argument Marcus had had with Eleanor over our finances. His voice filled the silent room, not from my memory, but from the speaker, raw and weary. It was a private audio log, a habit he'd picked up on deployment to process difficult events. "Had it out with Mother again," he said, his voice heavy with a pain I had only glimpsed at the time. "She doesn't care about my happiness. She only cares about controlling the legacy, the name, the money. She asked if I'd updated my will yet to protect the family bloodline." God, the arrogance. He let out a long, tired sigh. "She doesn't know that I already have. But it's to protect Lena from them. That's my real legacy. Protecting her." I closed my eyes, the love and the pain of his words washing over me. He had been my shield, my guardian, in ways I was only just beginning to comprehend. There was one last file. The date was from just a few weeks before he died. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the play button, knowing this would be the hardest one to hear. I pressed play. His voice was thin, fragile, strained by his illness, but the core of steel was still there. It was unmistakably the voice of my captain. "Lena," he began, and the sound of my name in his weakened voice shattered what was left of my composure. "If you're hearing this, it means the battle has begun. Don't hesitate. Don't you dare feel guilty. They chose this path a long time ago. Use everything I've left for you. Fight for it all. Fight not just for our house, but for our honor. For what we built." His voice hitched, and I could hear him take a ragged breath. "I love you. Now. Complete the mission, Lieutenant." He finished with a faint, almost inaudible whisper. "That's an order from your captain." The tears that streamed down my face weren't the hot tears of a grieving widow anymore. They were the cold, silent tears of a soldier who had just received her final command. The mission was clear, and I would not fail. Armed with Marcus's final order, I walked back into Charles Piton's office the next day. The grief was still a part of me, a constant low hum beneath the surface, but it was now encased in a shell of cold, hard purpose. I was no longer a victim reacting to an attack. I was a soldier launching a counteroffensive. "The reconnaissance is complete," I told Piton, placing the leather briefcase on his desk. "It's time for Phase 2. A slow, grim smile touched Piton's lips. He had already reviewed the copies Marcus had provided him. Indeed, Lieutenant, their arrogance has given us the perfect terrain for an ambush. The first move was a calculated piece of psychological warfare. Piton drafted a formal, cease and desist letter. It was a masterpiece of strategic omission. The letter was firm, demanding that the Colemans immediately vacate my property and return all stolen items. But it was also intentionally vague. Piton wrote about my rights as a grieving widow, citing general spousal privileges, but he deliberately left out our primary weapon, the tenancy by the entirety clause. The letter was bait, designed to look like the desperate move of a weak opponent with a flimsy legal standing. We were inviting them to underestimate me one last time. We didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, a response arrived from their lawyer, a man whose letterhead was as stuffy and overpriced as his client's. The tone was exactly what we'd hoped for: condescending, dismissive, and utterly arrogant. Their lawyer outright rejected our demand, stating that his clients were acting in accordance with the captain's verbal wishes and long-standing Coleman family tradition. He wrote that my emotional claim was understandable but legally baseless, and that the entire estate rightfully belonged to Eleanor's sons. Piton read the letter, and a rare, genuine grin spread across his face. "They took it," he said, the satisfaction evident in his voice. "Hook, line, and sinker. By putting their absurd verbal will argument in writing, they've officially documented their hostile intent. They've walked right into the kill zone." The next step was to spring the trap in person. Piton arranged a formal mediation meeting at his office, a staged attempt at reconciliation. My role was simple, yet it was the hardest acting job of my life. I was to be the broken widow. I wore a simple black dress, no makeup, and kept my hair pulled back. I sat beside Piton, my hands twisting a handkerchief in my lap, my eyes downcast, projecting an aura of defeated grief. The Colemans arrived like a conquering army. Eleanor swept in first, radiating smug triumph. Gerald and Timothy followed, smirking, looking around Piton's office as if they were already calculating its property value. They sat opposite us, a united front of entitlement. "Lena, dear," Eleanor began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "we're glad you agreed to this. We want to be reasonable. This entire situation is so unpleasant." I didn't respond, just gave a slight, sorrowful nod, as Piton had instructed. She continued, laying out her generous offer. They would provide me with a modest settlement, a sum that was probably less than they spent on landscaping each year. It was, she explained, enough to help me get back on my feet and start a new life, somewhere more suitable. In exchange, I would sign away any and all claims to the house, the clinic, and any other assets. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a decree. They were offering me pocket change to disappear from their lives forever. I remained silent, letting the humiliating offer hang in the air. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for my grateful, tearful acceptance. Finally, Piton spoke, his voice calm and professional. "Thank you for the offer, Eleanor. However, we must respectfully decline." Eleanor's smile tightened. "Decline? On what grounds?" "My client believes she is entitled to significantly more," Piton said evenly. A harsh, ugly laugh escaped Eleanor's lips. Gerald and Timothy exchanged amused glances. "Entitled to what, exactly?" she scoffed. "The girl has nothing. Marcus knew his duty to his family, to his bloodline." This was the moment. The final move. Piton leaned back in his chair, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He had already laid the groundwork in a previous call with their lawyer, subtly hinting at a non-existent loophole in the property deeds that had made them even more confident. "Well," he said with a calm finality that silenced the room, "it seems we have reached an impasse." He gathered his papers. "In that case, we will have to settle this at the official reading of the will. My office has scheduled it for this Friday at 10 a.m. We will, of course, require all of you to be present." He had them. He had dictated the time and place of their execution, and they were walking into it willingly, believing it was their coronation. Their faces were flushed with indignation, but also with the thrill of an imminent public victory. They couldn't see the perfectly constructed trap they were now standing in. There's a unique kind of satisfaction in watching arrogant people walk confidently into a trap of their own making. If you know that feeling, hit the like button. In the comments below, just write one word: checkmate. As they stood to leave, Eleanor paused and gave me a look of pity mixed with contempt. "So be it," she said, her voice full of smug certainty. "We will see you on Friday, Lena, and we will put this whole unfortunate matter to rest, once and for all." The plan was set. The trap was laid. Every piece on the chessboard was exactly where Mr. Peaton wanted it. By all logical measures, we were positioned for a decisive victory. But logic has very little to do with the ghosts that haunt you in the dead of night. I couldn't sleep. Thursday night bled into the early hours of Friday morning, and I found myself sitting on the couch in Sarah's guest room, staring out at the impenetrable blackness of the suburban Virginia night. The house was silent, but my mind was a battlefield. Every strategic advantage, every legal certainty, was being systematically dismantled by the one enemy I couldn't plan for: my own fear. For 8 years, the Colemans had conducted a masterclass in psychological warfare. Their primary weapon wasn't overt aggression. It was the slow, steady erosion of my sense of self-worth. And now, in the darkness, their voices were staging a final assault inside my head. "You don't belong here." Eleanor's voice, dripping with condescension from that first day. She comes from nothing. Her words to Marcus, relayed in his own heartbroken notes. Practical. Timothy's sneer as he looked at my watch. Toilet paper and canned beans. Gerald's cruel joke that had hollowed me out. I had the law on my side. I had Marcus's meticulous preparations. But what if it wasn't enough? What if, in their world, money and status and centuries of Richmond heritage were a force more powerful than the law itself? The fear was a cold, heavy thing in the pit of my stomach. The terror wasn't that I would lose the house. It was that they would prove me right. That I was, and always had been, an imposter in a world I was never meant to enter. That my honor, my service, my very identity were worthless when weighed against the Coleman name. Just as I felt myself sinking into that familiar abyss of self-doubt, my phone, sitting silently on the coffee table, buzzed. The screen lit up the dark room. It was a text message from an unknown number. My heart gave a painful lurch. I knew instinctively who it was from. With a trembling hand, I reached for it. The message was only 7 words. 7 words aimed like a sniper's bullet at the most vulnerable part of my soul. "You're going to lose. People like you always do." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. It was a direct hit. A cruel, perfectly timed strike designed to shatter my resolve at the final hour. People like you, the girl from Ohio, the daughter of an auto worker, the little soldier. All the years of their condescension, all their calculated slights were distilled into that single, venomous phrase. And for a terrifying moment, I believed them. The plan felt flimsy, the law felt distant, and I felt small and powerless, just as they had always wanted me to feel. I almost broke. I almost surrendered to the crushing weight of their narrative. But then, the image of Marcus's leather briefcase flashed in my mind. The anchor, the legacy. I stood up, my movements stiff, and walked over to where I'd left it by the door. I clicked the latches open, the sound echoing in the silent house. This time, I didn't reach for the legal files or the audio logs. I reached past the evidence, past the instruments of war, and pulled out a worn, bundled stack of letters tied with a simple ribbon. The letters Marcus had written me during his first deployment to Afghanistan, long before the Colemans were anything more than a distant, intimidating concept. I sat on the floor and untied the ribbon. The paper was soft, worn from countless readings. I began to read his words, and slowly another voice began to speak in the darkness, a voice of unwavering love and absolute belief. He didn't write about my rank or my efficiency as an officer. He wrote about my character. He wrote about the time I'd stood up to a senior officer who was bullying a young private, even when it could have cost me. He called it my unshakable moral compass. He wrote about how, when his own father passed away, my quiet, steadfast presence was the only thing that got him through. He called my loyalty unwavering. In one letter, he'd written about feeling lost in the chaos of deployment, how the world seemed to have no center. "But then I think of you," he wrote. "You are my North Star, Lena, the one fixed point in my universe. As long as I have you, I'm never truly lost." My North Star. Not the little soldier, not the girl from nothing. His North Star. I read for hours, letting his words rebuild what the Colemans had spent years trying to tear down. They had judged me by my bank account and my family tree. Marcus had judged me by the content of my character. And in his eyes, I was more than enough. I was everything. Their power was built on a foundation of money and arrogance. My power was built on a foundation of love and honor. And I knew which one was stronger. The first hint of dawn was breaking when I finally stood up. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. In their place was a cold, quiet calm. I knew what I had to do. I didn't choose a civilian suit for the meeting. I walked to the closet and took out the garment bag containing my Army service uniform, my dress uniform, my armor. I laid it out on the bed with ceremonial precision. The crisp, white shirt, the perfectly pressed dark blue jacket and skirt. I polished the brass on my belt until it gleamed. I pinned my rank and insignia onto the lapels, each piece a testament to years of service and dedication. As I dressed, I felt a transformation. With each button, with each perfectly aligned ribbon, I was shedding the identity of the grieving, uncertain widow and stepping back into myself. Lieutenant Lena Prince, United States Army. This uniform was everything they despised. It represented merit over inheritance, duty over privilege, and honor over wealth. Fully dressed, I stood before the full-length mirror. An officer stared back at me, her expression resolute. The woman who had crumpled on the floor in the dark hours before dawn was gone. A soldier stood in her place. I took a deep breath, my back straight, my shoulders squared. My final orders echoed in my mind, not as a memory, but as a direct command. "Complete the mission, Lieutenant," I whispered to my own reflection. When I walked into the conference room at precisely 10 a.m., the air was already thick with a tension you could cut with a knife. The room itself was designed to intimidate. A long, polished mahogany table, high-backed leather chairs, and a panoramic window overlooking the James River. It was a cathedral of corporate law, and the Colemans, seated on one side with their lawyer, looked perfectly at home. They were dressed in expensive, somber suits, the very picture of a grieving, powerful family. Smug satisfaction radiated from them like heat. Then, they saw me. The smugness flickered, replaced by a momentary flash of confusion, then contempt. I hadn't come as a widow. I had come as a soldier. My Army service uniform was immaculate, the brass on my belt buckle gleaming under the recessed lighting. My posture was straight, my movements economical. I took my seat opposite them, next to Mr. Peaton, and placed my cover squarely on the table in front of me. I didn't meet their gaze. I looked straight ahead, focusing on the man seated at the head of the table. This was Peaton's masterstroke. The man wasn't just a notary. He was Judge Lawrence Miller, retired from the Virginia Circuit Court, a man whose reputation for integrity was legendary in Richmond legal circles. He was a friend of Peaton's from their JAG Corps days, and he had agreed to act as the independent executor of the will. His presence stripped the Colemans of their home field advantage. They weren't dealing with a grieving girl anymore. They were under the scrutiny of the law itself. Eleanor, ever the matriarch, recovered first. She cleared her throat and offered a practiced, sorrowful smile. "Lena, Mr. Peaton, thank you for coming. I know this is difficult for all of us," she began, her voice a smooth performance of grief. "We all hope to resolve this quickly, in a way that would honor Marcus's true wishes." Their lawyer, a slick man named Preston, launched into their argument. He spoke of private family conversations, of sacred traditions, and of Marcus's supposed intent to keep the Coleman legacy intact. It was a flimsy narrative woven from half-truths and pure fiction. and Judge Miller listened with an impassive, stony expression that gave nothing away. When Preston finished, the room was silent. Then Mr. Peaton calmly reached into his briefcase and produced a single, sealed document. He slid it onto the center of the polished table. The sound was quiet, but it landed with the force of a gavel. "This," he said, his voice clear and steady, "is the last will and testament of Captain Marcus Coleman, properly signed, witnessed, and notarized. It is the only legally binding will that exists." He looked at Judge Miller, who nodded for him to proceed. "In it, Captain Coleman leaves his entire estate, including the residence on Monument Avenue, the veterinary clinic, and all financial assets, to his beloved wife, First Lieutenant Lena Prince." The self-satisfied mask on Eleanor's face cracked. A deep, ugly flush crept up her neck. "That's preposterous," she snapped, her voice losing its polished edge. "He would never. We will contest this. That document is a fraud." Gerald and Timothy murmured their agreement, puffing up with indignation. Their lawyer started to shuffle his papers, preparing for a fight. Piton held up a hand. "That is, of course, you're right," he said with lethal calm. But he didn't look at their lawyer. He looked directly at Eleanor. "But before you make that official declaration, perhaps you should hear a few more of the captain's final words." He reached back into the briefcase and pulled out another document. It was the letter from Marcus's intelligence file. "This is a letter Captain Coleman left in my care, to be read aloud at this meeting should any dispute arise." Peaton began to read. His voice was dispassionate, a neutral vessel for Marcus's scalding words. He started with the nicknames, "the little soldier," and "the constant belittling of my career." He read Marcus's pained account of the wine incident at the museum fundraiser, describing Eleanor's triumphant eyes. The flush on Eleanor's face deepened to a furious crimson. He continued, his voice never wavering. He read Marcus's notes on Timothy's sneering remarks about my watch versus his Rolex. He recounted Gerald's cruel joke about toilet paper and canned beans. With each sentence, another layer of their respectable facade was stripped away, exposing the rotten core beneath. The room was deathly silent. The only sound Piton's steady voice and the frantic, shallow breathing of the Colemans. Then came the hammer blow. "My wife has endured these slights with a grace my family has never deserved," Peaton read, quoting Marcus directly. "But I have recently discovered their contempt goes far beyond social snobbery. It has entered the realm of conspiracy." He paused, looking up from the page to let the weight of the words settle in the room. He then read the contents of the email from Eleanor to the real estate agent, sent 6 months before Marcus's diagnosis, requesting a quiet reappraisal for a near-future transfer of ownership. The color drained from Eleanor's face in an instant. She went from furious red to a ghastly, mottled white. She looked, for the first time, like a cornered animal. Gerald and Timothy stared at her, their mouths agape, shock and betrayal warring with fear in their eyes. Peaton wasn't finished. He let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment before delivering the final, decisive strike. "And finally," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "Captain Coleman, anticipating this very scenario, was careful to include a standard no-contest clause in his will." He set the letter down and folded his hands, looking directly at Eleanor, whose face was now a mask of pure horror. "For the benefit of your lawyer, this clause stipulates that should any beneficiary formally challenge the validity of the will, that beneficiary, along with their direct descendants, is immediately and irrevocably disinherited from the entirety of the estate. Not just the major assets, but every photograph, every piece of furniture, every single sentimental keepsake Marcus may have left for you." He leaned forward, his voice a quiet, devastating finality. "A moment ago, Mrs. Coleman, you officially and in front of a retired judge stated your intent to contest the will." He held her gaze. "As per your son's final wishes, you are now entitled to nothing. The game is over." It was as if the world had stopped. Eleanor stared at him, her mind clearly struggling to process the totality of her defeat. Then a choked, strangled sound escaped her throat. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply collapsed. Her proud, rigid posture dissolved, and she sank into her expensive leather chair, a broken, defeated woman. Gerald and Timothy looked from their mother's shattered expression to each other, raw panic dawning on their faces. The battle was over. The war was won. The aftermath of a battle is never glorious. It's a landscape of silence, exhaustion, and the quiet accounting of what's been lost. After Judge Miller officially adjourned the meeting, Peyton and I walked out into the sterile, quiet hallway of the law firm. There was no elation, no triumphant cheer. There was only the profound, bone-deep weariness of a war finally ended. The Coleman's lawyer was speaking in hushed, urgent tones to Gerald and Timothy, who both looked like they had just witnessed a fatal car crash. But my eyes were drawn to Eleanor. She was standing alone, a few feet away, her expensive suit looking rumpled, her perfectly coiffed hair somehow deflated. The queen had been deposed, and all that was left was a desperate, broken woman. She saw me looking and took a hesitant step forward. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, pleading desperation that was almost more horrifying to witness. "Lena, please," she began, her voice a reedy whisper I'd never heard before. "My son. He wouldn't have wanted this." I looked straight into her eyes, and what I felt wasn't hatred. It wasn't even the satisfaction of victory. It was just nothing. A vast, hollow emptiness. The part of me that had once craved her approval, that had flinched from her insults, had been cauterized and cut away. There was nothing left for her to hurt. "There's nothing left to say, Mrs. Coleman," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. I didn't raise it. I didn't accuse. I simply stated a fact. Then I turned my back on her and walked away, leaving her alone in the wreckage she had built. The next day, I reclaimed my territory. Peyton had arranged for 2 Richmond police officers to be present, not for a confrontation, but for what they called a civil standby, to ensure a peaceful transfer. When we arrived at the house, a professional moving truck was already parked at the curb. The front door was opened by a defeated-looking Timothy. The cardboard boxes belonging to him and Gerald were still stacked in the foyer, pathetic monuments to their failed invasion. They didn't speak a word as the movers I'd hired, under my calm direction, began the systematic process of removing every item that belonged to the Colemans. There was no argument, no resistance. The fight had gone out of them. I watched as they took out the ornate chairs Eleanor had coveted, the mahogany desk intended for Timothy's study, the boxes of silverware and china. It all looked so small and tawdry now, the spoils of a petty, soulless war. When the last box was loaded onto the truck, I had a locksmith, who was waiting patiently, change the locks for a second time. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing me inside and them outside for good, I stood in the middle of the nearly empty living room and took the first deep, clean breath I had taken in years. I was home. The silence was a balm, but it was short-lived. That evening, my phone rang. It was Gerald. I almost didn't answer, but some final, weary impulse made me accept the call. His voice was unrecognizable. The sneering arrogance was gone, replaced by a wheedling, sycophantic tone. "Lena." "Lena, it's me, Gerald," he said, as if I might have forgotten. "Listen, I've been thinking. Maybe we all just got off on the wrong foot. Marcus, he would have wanted us all to be a family, to forgive and forget." I listened in silence, my stomach turning. "So," he continued, his voice oozing false sincerity, "I was thinking, maybe you could just talk to your lawyer, just as a gesture of goodwill. That no contest clause? It seems a bit harsh, don't you think?" There were a few things of Marcus's, his watch collection, for example. He always said I could have them one day. And there it was. Not an apology. Not a hint of remorse. Just the same grubbing, grasping greed that had started all of this. He wasn't mourning his brother. He was mourning a collection of expensive timepieces. The exhaustion I felt was suddenly burned away by a cold, clear flame of finality. I cut him off. "Gerald," I said, my voice as quiet and sharp as a shard of ice. "You and your family had 8 years to treat me with a minimum of human decency. You failed." I took a breath. My silence from this point forward is the last kindness I will ever show you. I ended the call before he could respond, and immediately blocked his number. Then I blocked Timothy's, then Eleanor's. One by one, I erased them from my life as thoroughly as they had tried to erase me from mine. Alone again in the quiet house, I began to walk through the rooms, taking inventory of what remained. In the living room, I saw the trash can where Timothy had tossed our wedding photo. I reached in and pulled out the silver frame. The glass was cracked. I carefully removed the backing and took out the photograph. I wiped the smudge of ash from my face in the picture and set it back in its rightful place on the mantel. And suddenly, the grief for Marcus, the pure, untainted grief, hit me like a physical blow. A wave of sorrow so profound it buckled my knees. The victory, the legal battles, the anger. All of it faded away. And all that was left was the searing pain of his absence. But this time, the grief was different. It wasn't tangled up with bitterness or resentment. The mission was complete. His honor was protected. Now, finally, I could begin the real work of mourning my husband. I stood there for a long time, looking out the window at the garden he had loved so much, the roses he had planted for me just beginning to bud. The house was quiet. The war was over. And in the silence, a new, unfamiliar question began to form in my mind. What comes next? I picked up my phone, but it wasn't my lawyer I was thinking of calling. It was someone else entirely. 6 months later, sunlight, the warm, unapologetic sunlight of a Virginia spring, streamed through the living room windows, painting golden stripes across the hardwood floors. The house was no longer a cold, contested territory. It was a home, filled with the quiet hum of a new life. The silence was punctuated by the happy thump, thump, thump of a tail against a worn leather armchair. That was Major. I'd found him at a local animal shelter a few months back. He was a senior German Shepherd mix, with wise, soulful eyes and a touch of gray around his muzzle. The shelter staff said most people overlooked the older dogs. They wanted puppies. But I knew better. I knew what it felt like to be overlooked, to have your best years behind you and still have so much love to give. I named him Major, a rank just below captain, a quiet nod to the man who would have adored him. He was now the undisputed commander of the backyard and the keeper of my heart. My life had found a new rhythm. I still served as a logistics officer at Fort Lee, but the uniform no longer felt like armor. It was just a part of who I was, not the whole of my defense. I had methodically reclaimed the space in the house, keeping Marcus's most cherished belongings, his worn copy of All Creatures Great and Small, his favorite coffee mug, the silver-framed wedding photo on the mantel, and filled the rest with my own books, my own music, my own quiet peace. The most difficult decision came 2 months ago. I sold the veterinary clinic. Walking through it one last time, touching the cool stainless steel examination tables and looking at the empty kennels, was like saying goodbye to Marcus all over again. It was his dream, his passion project. But I realized his true legacy wasn't in a building. It was in his spirit of healing and service. Holding onto the property felt like clinging to a ghost. Letting it go felt like setting his spirit free. I didn't keep a single dollar from the sale. That phone call I made, the night I reclaimed the house, wasn't to a friend or a family member. It was to Charles Patton, with a new set of orders. Together, we used every penny from the sale of the clinic to establish the Captain Marcus Coleman Scholarship Fund. It was a nonprofit foundation with a single, clear mission: to provide full financial support for military veterans who wanted to pursue a degree in veterinary medicine. It was the perfect fusion of his two greatest loves, his profound compassion for animals and his unwavering loyalty to his fellow soldiers. The Coleman fortune, which they had hoarded and weaponized, was now being transformed, dollar by dollar, into a force for good. This morning, I sat in the garden, a pen and a single sheet of stationery in my hand. The roses Marcus had planted for me were in full, glorious bloom, their scent hanging sweet in the air. Major was lying at my feet, his head resting on my boots. It was time for my final after-action report. "My dearest Marcus," I wrote, "the battle is over. The mission is complete. I held the line, just like you knew I would. But your legacy? Your legacy is just beginning. Every time a wounded animal is healed by a veteran's gentle hands, every time a soldier finds a new purpose after their service, that will be you. You are still here, living and breathing in every act of kindness we send out into the world. I love you. Always. I folded the letter, but I didn't put it in an envelope. I knew he had already received the message. The final scene of this long campaign wasn't fought in a courtroom or a silent house. It took place in a modest auditorium at Virginia Commonwealth University. Today was the ceremony for the first recipients of the Captain Marcus Coleman Scholarship. I stood at the podium, dressed not in my uniform, but in a simple navy blue dress. I looked out, not at enemies or adversaries, but at a sea of hopeful faces. There were 5 of them, 2 Army veterans, a Marine, a sailor, and an airman. All of them bright, dedicated, and ready to start their next chapter. They were the first of many. I took a breath and smiled. It wasn't the tight, guarded smile of the past 8 years. It was a real smile, one that reached my eyes and filled me with a light I thought had been extinguished forever. "Good morning," I began, my voice clear and steady. My husband, Captain Marcus Coleman, believed that the greatest measure of a soldier isn't found in the battles they fought, but in the life they build afterward. He knew that the same hands that can be trained for war are the hands that are best suited for healing. His legacy wasn't about bloodlines or inheritance. His legacy was honor. I looked at the 5 young veterans, the first soldiers of Marcus's new mission. "And today," I finished, my voice thick with a gratitude that felt as vast and bright as the sunlit room. "Together, we honor that legacy by building a better world, one act of service at a time." I had finally found my peace, not by erasing the past or forgetting the pain, but by transforming it into a brighter future for others. My journey was long, and for years, I thought my story was about fighting back against disrespect. But I see now that it was always about fighting for something, for honor, for love, and for the belief that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths. Your own battles may look different, but the courage it takes to heal and build a new life is the same. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to be a part of our community. And in the comments below, I would be honored if you would simply write, "I am building my legacy." Because every single one of us is.